So welcome to lab number 6 on JMS resources. In this lab, we're going to create a JMS destination, specifically a queue. And to do that, we need to create some other resources to support it, such as persistent storage. So we're going to create some file-based persistent storage. And we're also going to create a JMS server and a connection factory. So applications need these things in order to publish or consume JMS messages. And then lastly, we're going to publish a test JMS message, and I'll show you how you can monitor your destinations using the admin console. So let's go ahead and open up a terminal window. Okay. And the first thing we want to do is start our admin server. So let's go to our domain home directory for demo domain and run the start WebLogic script to start the admin server. So once our admin server is up and running, let's go ahead and open up another terminal window. So in the lab, the first thing that we're going to do is create a file store, a file-based persistent store. And so in order to do that, we need to have a directory on the file system for the file store. So if we're following along in the lab says to create a file store directory under lab home. So let's go to lab home, which is U01 Udemy. And in here, let's go ahead and create a file store directory. Okay, so when you create this file store directory, make sure that the JVM process, the owner of the JVM process for WebLogic, has read-write access to this directory. Since I'm running WebLogic as myself, my user ID, and I'm creating this directory as my user ID, then there should not be any problems. So once you've gone ahead and created the file store directory, let's go ahead and log into the admin console. All right, so go ahead and log in as WebLogic. And so to create a file store, this is pretty easy. So if you go under domain structure, click on services, click on persistent stores, and then click on new. And when you click on new, you can see that there's 3 types of data sources that you can create. There's a simple file store, there's a database store, JDBC store, then there's this replicated store for WebLogic. WebLogic is an Oracle engineered system. WebLogic is essentially an infrastructure as a service. It is a very large, expensive piece of hardware that can support and scale out in the cloud and host hundreds, if not thousands, of WebLogic servers. So I can't do that in this environment, but for now, let's go ahead and create that file store. So table 10 in the lab guide provides the parameters for creating this file store. And as you can see, there aren't that many parameters to specify. It's very simple indeed. So let's go ahead and give this a name. So I'm going to call it demo FS for file store. And file stores cannot be clustered. They are specific to a WebLogic server. You can create multiple persistent stores if you'd like, but unlike a database store, a file store can only be targeted to a single server. So let's go ahead and target it to the admin server, which is the default. And then in directory, specify the directory to the file store directory that you just created. And it's got to be the absolute full path. Once you've done that, go ahead and click OK. And that's it. Really simple. So you can see the confirmation message above that says the file store was created successfully and that no changes or restarts are required. So go ahead and click on the file store itself, and you can see on the configuration tab there are some additional settings here, specifically the synchronous write policy. And this determines the behavior for how data is written to that file store. So typically the default direct write is perfectly fine. Picking any one of these options will affect the performance of the file store. And to learn more about these options and what they do and how they impact performance and application performance, please go online at oracle.com and take a look at the WebLogic server docs for more info. So if you click on the monitoring tab, just like all other types of resources within WebLogic, gives you a summary of statistics for that resource. So for the file store, we can see that it provides us health status and then read and write counts for that file store. Since we just created it and we haven't used it yet, all of these are 0. And if we click on the Connections tab, we can see that there's nothing connected to this file store at this time. So when we create the JMS server and the queue and we actually publish a test message, we should see something in these tables. Okay, so now that we're done with the file store, let's go ahead and create the JMS server. That's the next step. So go back under Domain Structure, under Services, Messaging, click on JMS Servers. Then click on New. And according to Table 11, let's go ahead and specify the name for this JMS server. And again, there's even fewer properties for configuring this JMS server initially. So our name is going to be Demo JMS Server. Not very original, but it serves its purpose. And then under Persistent Store, click the drop-down list and select the one that we just created, Demo FS. Now, conveniently, WebLogic has added a button here to create a new store. So when you create a JMS server, you must always have a persistent store associated with it. So you can save some time by clicking this button here, and it will take you through the file store creation process. So go ahead and click Next. And then on the targeting page, JMS servers can only be targeted to a single instance. We cannot target JMS servers to a cluster. And you want JMS resources deployed across the cluster or across multiple managed servers, then you need to create a separate JMS server per managed server. That's just how it is. So go ahead and select the admin server and click Finish. Now, let's go ahead and click on the Demo JMS server and take a look at some general configuration items. So we see the name here, we see the persistent store, and some various other server-specific configuration items. And a lot of these are already defaulted, even though there's not value specified here. But for instance, the paging directory, we can override where WebLogic temporarily stores JMS message bodies, message buffer size. So this determines when the JMS server will write a JMS message to disk. Initially, the message is stored in memory, and at some point, it will have to write them to disk. So the message buffer size attribute determines when a JMS server will write JMS messages that are in memory out to disk. A value of -1 means that WebLogic will automatically determine, based on the amount of available memory in the JVM heap, when to write those messages to disk. So if you've got JMS in your architecture, in your WebLogic domain, you can actually play with this attribute to performance tune your JMS configuration. If you're pushing a lot of JMS messages and they're very large or they're very small and it's high volume, you might want to tune this parameter if you have I/O or memory issues. So let's scroll back up and click on Thresholds and Quotas. So I mentioned in the lecture that you can actually define quotas for JMS. So we can specify how many messages, how large the JMS queue gets or destinations get. So quotas are defined by the JMS server. The JMS server applies them to whatever resources are attached to it. So we can define thresholds for bytes, low and high. We can define thresholds for the amount of messages. So for instance, we can basically define how large a queue can actually get. And then there's this very important maximum message size attribute down here below. This is the maximum number of bytes allowed for an individual JMS message. So if you want, you can actually limit how large of a message your system can accept by defining a value here. Now scroll back up and click on the monitoring tab. And the monitoring tab has several different subtabs. The summary table tells us how many destinations are associated with this JMS server, how many messages have passed through it, how many have been processed or received, and how many are pending. So lots of really interesting information here. We don't see anything now because we have nothing hooked up to it. So later on, we'll publish a test message and we'll see how this affects these statistics. So if you click on active destinations, we don't have any active destinations at this time. We're going to create one later on in the lab, and that'll be a JMS queue, and we should see that show up in this table. Same with active transactions. We don't have any applications that are using global transactions, so we don't see any transactions here. Active connections, this is the same thing. We don't have any clients right now, and a client can be an EJB like an MDB or a message-driven bean or another application or a third-party system. We don't see that because we don't have any of those at this time.